many years. Then there was Mr. and Mrs. John Masson, Jr., their family, Robert, Billy and Kathleen. Billy is married and stays in the village now. He does a lot of work for the hall. Runaway, now surrounded by trees. Mr. and Mrs. Patterson and family. Then Mr. and Mrs. Bob Uni and family. Jimmy, Jock, Margaret, Mitchell, Stanley, Alistair, Jean and David. Then Mr. and Mrs. Jimmy Eccles and daughter Kay, who married Ian Cameron at Ditch Heads. When Jimmy retired, he was in great demand as a mole catcher. Craigmill Lodge. This estate, I am told, from good authority, Jock Uni, was owned by Alter Estates. I can remember Mr. Bibby, who stayed in the Hawk House in Elgin, having the shooting every year. The Hawk is now the Mansion Hotel. Then Colonel Douglas, a brother of Mrs. Kathleen Holdsworth of Dallas Lodge, bought it. John Duff from Rothes was his driver in the army, and he married Cathy Strachan. They stayed with the Colonel here as chauffeur handyman and Cathy as housekeeper. Mr. and Mrs. James Mackay and family, Jim, Ella, Margaret, Ian and Winnie, followed by the MacDonalds. Then Mr. and Mrs. Bob Mackenzie and family, Ruby and George. The Cots, number 1. Mr. and Mrs. William Petrie and family, William, Charles, Margaret and Gordon. Petrie was horseman at Reninver, followed by Mr. and Mrs. Charles Tullach and family, Mary, Charles and Isabel. Charlie was a labourer on the estate. Number 2, the Cots. Mr. and Mrs. Mill with daughter Christina. He was a horseman too. Then Mr. and Mrs. Alec Proctor and their 2 sons, also a horseman. Then Mr. Jimmy Jack, a joiner on the estate. Ditch Heads. Mr. and Mrs. Frank Ross and family, John, Lily, Jessie, Alec and Robert. I worked here for Frank for 6 months before going to Elgin Central Garage in 1941. No matter where I was ploughing with the horses, Frank's wife Lily always came with my fly cup. I drove home Frank's first tractor from Elgin, a green Fordson on iron wheels. Frank flitted to Monaghy and Jean Cameron was the next tenant. Her son Ian married Kay Eccles of Runaway. They have 2 daughters, Hazel and Laura. Ian still farms here today. From Ditch Heads, looking at the Wangy Croft, or where it was, where Mr. and Mrs. Farquharson and son George and daughter Nell stayed. Woodside. Annie Garrow stayed here. Then Benji Finlay retired to here from Reninver. Then Mr. and Mrs. Johnny MacDonald retired to here from the estate. School teachers lodged with them. A Miss Grant from Dunphail, then Shoney Campbell from the level at Burney. Nell and her daughter Margaret live here today. Fraser stayed here. There was a small steading at the east end of the house. Next to the house was the cart shed, where the children from the Branch Hill area left their cycles when at the school. Then there was Mr. and Mrs. Sandy Wilson, ex-army man, a true blue. He walked from Dallas to Fort George and back every month for his army pension, which he could have drawn at the Dallas post office. He refused lifts. Now John Wilson, the present estate forester, has rebuilt it to retire to. Dallas from the West End. The Dallas War Memorial, in memory of the men who did not return from the 2 world wars. The Well Green, where the wooden snowplough lay year in, year out. Biddle's sideshows came here once or twice a year. The first farm on the road coming from Nakanda to Dallas. Jessie Leslie stayed here with her goats and came down to the house in the village, now called Thrums, with her goats in the winter time. Bog, better known as the Red Housie, where Annie Bogie stayed. Again, look at the old photo albums and you will see her, not a pretty sight. I remember it being the meeting place for the beaters when in the area. Turwinny. The Grants were the last people to stay here. Mrs. Grant lived in the house next to Mormond in the village when she was not at Kinhardy, Garton, where her son Douglas Garrow farmed. Douglas married and shifted to the Mains of Cardrells. They had two sons, Charles and Duncan. Duncan now has a joinery business in the village. This was originally the shepherd's house for the estate. Mr. and Mrs. George Stoddart and family. Then Mr. and Mrs. McIntosh. He was called the Hyde Park Shepherd, as he told us he used to herd sheep there. Then there was Mr. and Mrs. Sutherland and family. There were quite a few bairns, but I can remember on two of them, Phoebe and James. James was on my class at the school. I think they were the last people to stay at the Succoth. Tehurn, Mr. and Mrs. Donald McInnes farmed here. I can remember on the Dysplenish sale. Then Jock Stewart, who married Mrs. Dunbar of the post office. Jock was a brother of Louis Stewart of Scotticlies. Then there was the Spences, now the estate. White Rashes, a ruin amongst the trees, but a wooden lunch hut where the shooters used to have their lunch. Old Burn always looked like this to me. Used to be a hive of industry here in the summertime, everyone cutting peats for their winter fire. Each house on the estate had what they called a lair, where they cut peats free of charge from the estate. Many a peat I cast, set up and drove home by horse and cart. Alta-Jewish, Mr. and Mrs. Bert Anderson, whose two brothers farmed at Maine at Elgin. Gordon from Maine put his hives of bees to here for the heather honey. Then there was the Mackenzie family. Then the estate. The estate horseman was Donald Grant. Goat Craig, always been a ruin to me, but the Garras of Tyrcastle Cottage were brought up here. Tom Cork, Annie Leslie coming to the village for her errands with her white shellt and machine. Then Mr. and Mrs. William Scott and daughter Stella. Also the feed loon, Jock Young.